It was bad, and it turned out bad, didn't it? It turned out bad. On down there to part D, chapters 6 through 8, the Lord called Gideon. There in verse 11 of chapter 6, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joshua the Azarite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat, and the witnesses to hide it from the Midianites. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. We've recently studied about that with Jay as well. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us? Anyway, the start of Gideon there. Part 5, Abimelech's reign of terror, chapters 8 through 10. In chapter 9 and verse 22, I have that marked there. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, and the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Moving on down to part F, Ammon, chapters 10 and 12, chapter 10, verses 6 through 9, particularly, and then a story that we're all pretty much familiar with is the last of the judges there. Number 7 is the Philistines, chapters 13 through 16. Who are we talking about here? Samson. Samson, one of the cooler stories in the Bible. What are some things that Samson is famous for being? A Nazarite. So what did being a Nazarite entail? Didn't cut your hair. Servant of God. What did this... May explains why I'm not very strong, huh? He took a Nazarite vow. One of the things that were included in that was he should never put a razor to his head, they said. But during this story, Samson was known as being extremely what? Strong. Y'all remember the story? How many folks did he kill with the jawbone of a donkey? It was a pile of them, wasn't it? It was a pile of them. I think it said 1,000, David. I think you're right. 1,000 men he killed with the jawbone of a donkey. But then he kind of stumbled. He got hooked up with an old girl that's name was Delilah. So Delilah's counterparts said, look, let's go ahead and tell it like it is. What was Delilah? She was a prostitute. Samson apparently fell in love with her, didn't he? So anyway, her countrymen said, you got to figure out how we can defeat this guy. Get him to tell you how he can be bound. If I remember right, he messed with her a little bit. And he first said, yeah, if they bring some bowstrings in here, I believe, and tie me down with bowstrings, I can't get away. Well, obviously he was messing with her, because when he jumped up from his sleep, he popped them. And then he said, if they bind me with new ropes. Well, she kept getting on to him for lying to her and said, if you love me, you wouldn't do this. And finally, at the end, he said, no, actually, my strength comes from my hair. And she took some locks from his hair, shaved his head, or ever what. And he, at that time, didn't know God had left him. And then he was overcame. They bound him. They put him in prison, so to speak. They got him down to entertain him. Once again, that's the low, then's the high. he talked him into what? Letting him lean against the pillars of the building there. He said, just let me rest while I entertain you. He prayed to God. I think it said there was 3,000 in that building. So Samson sacrificed his own life in doing so, I believe, but he pulled the pillars of the walls down. They come crashing down and killed all those as well. Part 3, the depravity of it, religious depression in chapter 17 and 18, the moral degradation in 19, and the tribal dissension in chapters 20 and 21. The 12 judges who served, and there's a chart toward the end of this lesson if you would like to refer to that in any time in the future. The first Nazirite recorded, we just talked about that in chapter 13, verses 2 through 5. I'll go ahead and read that for you. There was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And an angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, or eat nothing unclean, for behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall ever come on his head. For the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Cool story. The strongest man in terms of physical strength, and that comes from chapter 15 and verse 15, and that's when he talks about how many he slayed with the jawbone of that donkey. If I can get these pages to come apart here. Chapter 15 and verse 15, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. The angel of the Lord is mentioned about 80 times in the Old Testament, and no less than 20 of these occurs in Judges. A bloodthirsty son is one of the subjects, Abimelech, Gideon's son, and a heartbroken father, Jephthah. And the army be killed. This is kind of scary to me. An army killed because of the mispronouncing of a word. Judges 12 and verse 6 is where that story comes from. And they said to him, then say Shibboleth. And he said Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of Jordan. At that time, 42,000 of the Ephraimites fell. So apparently it was a big deal that somebody had an H in their name, not to leave that out at that time. 42,000 people dead on account of it. And you're going to hear me mispronounce a lot of words as long as we're in this Old Testament. Some key verses that are here in our lesson for the last week and this week is chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to their judges, and they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. And also chapter 21 and verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Does that sound familiar? It does, doesn't it? Even if you watch TV any length of time today, you will be led to believe that you are entitled to do whatever you think is right. Whatever you think is right. We studied about that Wednesday night in Tim's lesson about how what we think has very little to do with what God says. All right. I think, now this is where it kind of gets confusing here. We go back now. That was page 3 and 4. Let's turn back a page to page 5, and that is the beginning of the story of Ruth. Brother Vestal, for whatever reason, decided to combine these two in the same lesson, and I kind of see the rationality of it. So in the dark period of the nation of Israel, when judges were over them, you've heard Dan say in his class before, and we've talked about it before, there's always been a remnant, a few, that all the terrible things that we read about, they didn't take part in that. And this story of Ruth is a story of one such family that falls into that category. I'll kind of wait till we get down to the gist of the lesson, and we may just stop and kind of tell the story there, and hopefully y'all can help me fill in the blanks that I'm missing. Ruth, number 1, there is a beautiful story during the distressing days of the judges, a lily in the cesspool of sin. Too often bad news robs us of good news, and I say amen to that. This book begins with funerals and ends with a wedding. Naomi from bitterness to blessedness, Ruth from loneliness to love. The theme of faithfulness in a time of faithlessness talks about renouncing, requesting, reaping, and rejoicing, and that's Ruth's choice, her service, her appeal, and her joys. The authorship is uncertain, perhaps written in a time of David. Ruth 1 and 1 at the time frame of Judges, we know that. 4 distinct geographical settings: the country of Moab, field in Bethlehem, the threshing floor in Bethlehem, and the city of Bethlehem. It's kind of cool. Somebody tell me, was Ruth an Israelite to start with? She was not. But she ended up being part of the genealogy of who? Jesus. Real interesting story. It's kind of story, and it applies to any of us, but I think especially the ladies, how kind of no matter what the circumstances are, the value of doing what's right. That's pretty much what she did her whole life. She just did what was right, and she found favor in God's eyes because of that. We look over at Ruth chapter 4. We'll go ahead and touch on this before we move on. In verse 17, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, and this is talking about Ruth's son. And they named him Obed, and his father was Jesse, the father of David. And we'll go over to Matthew chapter 1 later and see how that fits in to the genealogy of Christ. Well, looks like we're going to go there right now. It's pretty much the exact same read. Matthew chapter 1. And verse 5. And Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz, by Rahab. and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And we all know that Jesus descended from David. So Ruth mentioned there in Matthew chapter 1 as well. All right, now we'll start our lesson. So Ruth's mother-in-law, her husband, and her two sons apparently were living under this period of Judges in quite a time of drought and famine, to the point that it looks like he loaded the family up and went to Moab. Now, please, those of you that are studied in this, feel perfectly free to fill in the blanks. They get over there. Naomi's husband dies, and the boys married two of these Moabite women. I struggle not saying Ophrah when I say one of the sisters' names, but I believe it was Oprah. Does that sound right? One Oprah and the other Ruth. We'll kind of touch on the lesson as we go through here. Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons moved to Moab during a famine. Boys married Moabite girls. Elimelech, two sons die. And then, kind of interjecting in between these two storylines here, the two sons die. Things are really difficult on Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, to the point where Naomi tells them, go back to your family, take shelter in them, and worship their God. Neither one of them at first wanted to go along with that, but this Oprah, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Well, yeah, I told you it was coming too. Eventually she was convinced to go back to her family, but Ruth said, no, wherever you go, I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to live and die with you, and I'm going to worship your God. So anyway, we get on down there to part C there in the first deal. It says Naomi returns home accompanied by Ruth. Kind of in between there in the next little part of the storyline here, it appears there's quite a buzz in town when Naomi comes back in and Ruth is with her. I believe to the point that Naomi even changes her name there in that part of the story. But anyway, Ruth ends up to try to make a way to provide for herself, and Naomi goes out with a bunch of workers into a field owned by this guy named Boaz. And the way I understood the story, she was the only young lady out there. The rest of it were men. So she goes to work. Boaz, who owns the field, comes in and says, who is that? And they kind of tell him the story. Well, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law. Told the story of how she stuck with her, and he comes up to Ruth and he says, look, you don't have to do this. On and on and on the story goes. You just sit over there and kind of watch over them. Well, she goes back to work anyway. One of the workers there said, man, she has worked from daylight till dark with the exception of one little short rest. They get back. She kind of tells her mother-in-law what had happened. Naomi, her mother-in-law, starts trying to make plans to get Ruth remarried. She says, look, this is what needs to happen, on and on and on. So we get down there to part 3 in that lesson. It says, Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz so he might fill the position of kinsman or redeemer. Apparently he is related to that family. Don't fuss at me for mispronouncing this. I believe it was Elimelech or Abimelech or something like that. And he tells Ruth, he said, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do here, but actually there's somebody that's a little bit closer to kin to Naomi than even I am. So apparently Naomi owns some property there, and Boaz goes to this guy and says, look, if you buy this property from Naomi, Ruth kind of comes with it. So this guy says, no, I've heard the story of what's going on, how she did everything right. I can't do that, but gives Boaz the opportunity to do that. So there's a little part of the story in there where Naomi sends Ruth into where Boaz is sleeping. She's supposed to uncover his feet, lay down by his feet, to kind of get all this started. After he said that, he said, Ruth, after the guy said, no, I can't do that, it says Ruth returns home and just leaves the matter to God. And I think that's one of the coolest parts of the story. In my mind, one of the most difficult things I face in life is not trying to count on me to fix things. In other words, whatever's going on in my life, I'm thinking I need to take some kind of action to get this straightened out. And sometimes I think I can learn a lot from people like Ruth here. It says when that was said, she just went home and left it up to God. You know, she didn't beg, she didn't plead, she didn't do anything special there. And so often, I think it would so benefit our lives if we would learn that lesson there and just say in our mind, I'm done. I've done what I can. God, it's up to you now, which is exactly what Ruth does here.
The amazing thing to me about it is that Naomi had been blaming God for all the bad that happened to her.
That's true. That's true. And Naomi being an Israelite. Ruth, once again, the one that wasn't supposed to have the faith is the one that has the faith. Do we just see that over and over and over, don't we? The people that should have the faith seem to be lacking, and somebody you never guess came from a completely different world, a completely different religion, worship completely different gods, are the ones that have the faith. Good lesson for us as well. Yeah. That's right. Yep. Yep.
And so you said that Naomi changed her name. There might have been some animosity between
The Moabites.
and the Moabites.
Right.
So that would make the story even more interesting. That here's a lady that probably not looked on very well. And then another thing was Ruth was gleaning in the field. That's for the very, very poorest of poor people. Here, we talk about the story of rags to riches, I guess.
Yeah.
The poorest of girls down there in the corner of
I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly what the definition of gleaning is. I wish I'd have looked that up.
Gleaning was required the Israelites when you harvested a field and you mule couldn't go in the corner.
Oh, okay.
You left the corners for the poor people, and that's part of the law of Israel. All the law of Moses that and they call it the gleaning. You left that for the poor people. The poor people could go get that from the landowners.
Because they were going to leave it otherwise, probably. So she combined in the tough spots, I guess, to his way of saying. I bet that rig he's got does have struggle with the corners there. Oh, goodness. So this, in turn, after all this story kind of goes down, Boaz ends up, after this near kinsman there in part 4, doesn't take the opportunity to buy this land from Naomi. He buys it, and he marries Ruth, and they have this son named Obed. Now here is where we turn the page, and there's 3 or 4, and we turn it one more time, and we're to 7, where we're supposed to be. Prominent characters in this book: Elimelech, Naomi, apparently, which means pleasant, changed her name actually to Mara, which is bitter, because of as Tom said, she wasn't able to see the rainbow, so to speak. She wasn't able to see the rainbow. She didn't have the faith to know it was there. Now, I'm looking at this word, so I believe I can get it closer. Orpah, not Oprah. Orpah, stubbornness, Mahlon, Chilion, and Boaz, the guy she ended up marrying. The marriage there, the Levirate marriage there in part 2, she ended up, as Jay said, going from being the poorest of the poor, picking in the fields where they just left for scraps, to actually being a young lady of prominence, marrying very well and doing very well in the rest of her life, living above the norm of the day, as it says. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more down here at the end. But don't you imagine some of the young ladies around there were talking about how lucky she was? How lucky was she? She wasn't lucky at all, was she? She did what was right, and she was blessed because of it. I mentioned at the first of the lesson that the gist of the lesson for this young lady is the same as it is for all of us: the value of just doing what's right, making decisions. For those of you, I see a lot of young parents in the audience this morning. I don't know how well it worked, but my children and I have talked a lot about the importance and the value of making good decisions. So many things we could save ourselves a lot of our struggles by just doing what God wants us to do. And oftentimes I think we don't even know it. We don't know what the outcome would have been had we made a different decision. It's not going to be. Everybody can be faithful when things are going good, can't they? Go ahead, Dan. Right.
You know, daddy can get you out of trouble. You're 12, for the most part.
Yeah.
But when you come and go, you need to be with him because you're going to be answered. You alone. To God.
The next one was heavenly provision. We saw that. Humble supplication. Her humility is so obvious in that whole story. Key verses we've already read, 1:16 and 3:11. Kinsman, the word happens 13 times here in the book of the Ruth, and redeemed 7 times just in chapter 4. Doubt sees the obstacles, faith sees the way. Boy, I'm going to underline that in my lesson. And that is so true, much like Kenneth was just talking about. We're all going to have struggles, we know that. We don't know what they're going to be tomorrow, but they're coming. No matter where we are, man, you shake somebody's hand, give them a hug, how's it going? Oh, it couldn't be going any better. The truth of it is what? Well, just hang on. Because it's coming. All of us are going to have storms and struggles in our lives. The difference in the outcome is going to be if we face that with doubt or if we face that with faith. Game changer. Doubt sees the darksome night, faith sees the day. Doubt dreads to take the step, faith soars on high, doubt whispers, who believes, and faith answers, I do. Cool lesson. I am ready to be out of this book of Judges. I'm not going to kid you. We're fixing to start next week over here on a survey of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Interesting lesson. I hope that you'll all join us starting next Sunday morning if the Lord tarries and is coming.